All right, I get the honor and privilege of leading today's devotion. So I get to continue in Second Corinthians, or as you say, 2 Corinthians, in chapter 2, verses 1 to 4. So let me get going. It says, "So I made up my mind that I would not make another painful visit to you, for if I grieve you, who is left to make me glad, but you whom I have grieved? I have I have written this as I did, so that when I wrote as I did, so when I came, I should not be distressed by those who ought to make me rejoice. I had confidence in all of you, that you would all share my joy. For I wrote you out of great distress and anguish of heart, and with many tears, not to grieve you, but to let you know the depth of my love for you." Excellent. So this is about the third talk on Paul changing his plan. So I'll do a quick what can easily be seen from this passage. In the first one, we can see that Paul has been to Corinth before and that it was painful. We can also see that Paul's not coming again at this time. In the second verse, we can see Paul's intent was to go and encourage them and be encouraged mutually. But instead it was rather a journey of mutual disheartening. Or it would be a journey of mutual disheartening if he did go. And in verse 3, Paul's writing was meant to bring joy, not distress. And we'll look at a little bit of Paul's character in a second. And verse 4, Paul thought they would hear his heart, his love, and wanting them to strive to be their best. But instead, all they heard was criticism. I've been there before. So as Julian and Steve mentioned before, Paul has been mentoring this rather dysfunctional group of new believers, and I think it would be good to look at Paul's character to understand why his response is as such, and how to read this chapter or this book. So before meeting with Jesus in Damascus, he was an extremely zealous Pharisee. He told us this himself, as he helped with the hunt and capture of Christians. He was highly educated, as we can know this because he's a Pharisee. He's a skilled debater, a great speaker, and a good writer. We can see this through all his letters. And we can also see that he had bad penmanship, because he always said, "You can see that this is my writing because it's in my hand," and it was always written big or something. He was also very driven. After meeting Jesus, he still struggled with a bit of a temper, but used his knowledge and skills to share Jesus and train others. He was very driven. He was perseverant. He gave God all the glory. He was bold, content, sincere, industrious, a leader, a strategist, and sharp-minded. He was also yielded to God's leading. I wish that was said about me. I recently watched a documentary, maybe some of you watched it, on the American basketball player Michael Jordan. It might not mean the same to British people, but it was a pretty good documentary on one of the best basketball players ever known. It explains how he and the Bulls became the best team in the NBA from a pretty terrible team. He came from a competitive family, and Jordan always had to prove himself to his dad in fighting for the attention between his brothers. He had an older brother named Larry that always got his father's attention, and that really bugged Michael Jordan, and it probably caused him to become the man he was. And when he finally arrived to the NBA, all the coaches knew he was great, but his team was known for having parties and doing drugs. And it talked about how he went to he was like looking for his team during one of the road games just to blow off some steam. He knocks on the door and they're like, shh, shh, shh. And he finds out they're all in there. They let him in. They're like, "Oh, it's just the rookie. Let him in." And they're all doing drugs, having a party. And through the discipline instilled by his parents, he didn't partake in this. He just shrugged it off and walked away. And his actual determination caused the team's drive to shift. So even in that first team, the team motivations began to shift because of his own drive. And the organization started to form a team around his talent and complement his abilities. And at first, they tried to just make it the Michael Jordan show, the first coach, but then they allowed him to become uh, they allowed him to join a team of people that complemented him well. And when the other teammates speak of how Michael Jordan became Michael Jordan and his abilities, they spoke of his drive, but they spoke of it in a mixed sense. They knew he was the best, but when Jordan constantly challenged them to play the same level as him, they saw him as arrogant, stubborn, and obnoxious. Or as Richard might say, difficult, prickly, and annoying. That's what Richard described Paul as. So Paul was also driven. We all know people like this who have an itch, who have that drive that never is settled. They can't just stop. I know this because I'm married to one of these people. When we encounter these people, we can be both inspired and challenged, but we don't all learn that the same way. We see when Paul encounters hardship, he rejoices. We see when he's criticized, he sees it as a good thing. He always has a defense and answer for every situation. We know these people. He strives to be perfect. He looks at Jesus and he thinks he can actually be like him. And I say this because Paul expects others to think and learn the way he does, striving so much to be better that any criticism becomes beneficial, regardless of the other's motivations. So when we see him crying and groaning when these people aren't understanding him, and he's trying to see, why can't you see the joy that's coming out of this letter for you? And all they get is criticism. That's why, because he has such a high bar for himself, and he sees that in other people. So I'm going to read this again, and just with this in mind. So I made up my mind that I would not make another painful visit to you. For if I grieve you, who is left to make me glad but whom I have grieved? I wrote as I did, so that when I came, I should not be distressed by those who ought to make me rejoice. I had confidence in all of you that you would share my joy. For I wrote you out of great distress and anguish of heart, and with many tears, not to grieve you, but to let you know the depth of my love for you. So I hope we can all love others the way Paul does, to see something in those around us, the way that they may not see in themselves, and encourage them in their giftings. We may get it wrong, but like Paul, just to be able to take these difficulties and make mistakes as we make mistakes along the way, and these critiques that are given to us, take them as they come, and the ability to be pruned and become more like Jesus.